A slap. I didn't expect it, and the slap threw me backwards, ringing in my ears. What the hell was that? I screamed. Wait, I need to go back a few weeks and explain some things, or this won't make any sense. I entered the house from the garage and walked into the kitchen shortly after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which is when I usually finish work. The company I work for has several clients in the UK, so I start work at 7 in the morning every day so that I have time to socialize with them. It took me a while to get used to this schedule, but now I like it. As I walked into the kitchen, I instinctively glanced at the bulletin board but only saw one entry: working late. Damn, that means I'll be eating dinner alone again tonight. When Anne and I were first married and living in this little apartment, we'd hung a chalkboard on the kitchen wall to coordinate our schedules. And when we bought a house, we continued that tradition. At first, we left awkward little love notes for each other. I remember leaving her a message that read, "I can't wait to get home from work, Cookie. I miss you already." When I got home the same day, she wrote, "I miss you even more, and don't call me Cookie." We first met at a small bakery, and I started calling her Cookie back then. Now that she had established herself, she didn't want others to know what I called her, but it was hard for me to give up the habit. Yes, I know. The notes and nicknames sound a bit syrupy, but they meant a lot to me, especially now that the syrup in our relationship seems to have lost its sweetness. These days, I'm lucky enough to find a succinct note that says what she'll be doing and when she'll be home. Or, like today, simply getting held up at work. I'm not naive. I know that even the brightest gems lose their luster over time, and routines and habits can dull the glow of new love. But over the past year, it seemed to me that it wasn't just habit that had changed our relationship. It wasn't just that we stopped leaving each other love notes. It got to the point where we hardly spent any time together. Part of the problem, of course, was my work schedule. On weekdays, I left for the office long before she got out of bed. But her job compounded the problem. You see, Anne is a realtor, and while her office has regular business hours, she is pretty much at the mercy of any seller or buyer. Want to make an offer on a house at 9 p.m.? Anne will come to you to help with the paperwork. Trying to sell your home? Anne will organize an open house that will take her all day Saturday or Sunday. Basically, you get the idea. But that's not all. 2 years ago, Anne got it into her head that she was going to run for city council in our district. I tried my best to talk her out of it, but her friends and associates kept encouraging her. At the time, I wasn't too worried because our longtime councilman had gotten 2/3 of the vote in the last election. But halfway through that campaign, his wife suffered a stroke and he withdrew from the election to take care of her. Before I realized what was happening, my wife had already taken her seat on the city council. This, of course, entailed a whole new set of responsibilities. It wasn't just the monthly council meetings. Soon, Anne was meeting with constituents, serving on task forces, and doing all the things that elected officials do, for crying out loud. Hey! When I stood with her on the platform at the hotel on election night when she won re-election, I was proud of her and her success. When I saw how happy she was in her new responsibilities, I was happy for her. But as the weeks went by, our time together dwindled. When I tried to broach the subject, she became defensive, accusing me of jealousy and lack of support. All of this would have been bad enough, but over the past year, I had noticed a change in her attitude. It wasn't just that she had grown colder toward me. Lately, when we spent time together, I felt a condescending attitude toward her that bordered on contempt. Of course, there was nothing overt about it, it was just the way I felt. When I had some free time, I thought a lot about the situation. You won't be surprised to learn that it put me in a bad state of mind. I worried about the loss of time spent with her and resented the demands that had come between us. I still remember one evening when we were infatuated with each other. We had just retired to the bedroom when the phone rang. You guessed it. It was one of her real estate clients with an urgent matter she had to take care of. Even today, that incident haunts me. But to be honest, I also remember when I had to cancel our weekend plans when one of my company's biggest clients had a network outage. Now I was sitting at the kitchen table trying to make sense of it all. Maybe I was being unfair to Anne. Maybe I was just jealous because other people needed so much of her time. But as a network engineer, I had developed the ability to identify problems from seemingly insignificant symptoms. My intuition told me that it wasn't just the factors I had considered so far, and it wasn't just our crazy schedules that were making me uncomfortable. I realized it was about her attitude toward me. When she first became a council member, she was so eager to tell me about everything that was going on in council and city hall, but now she didn't bring them up anymore. Maybe it was because the new girl had gotten older, or maybe she decided it just wasn't worth talking to me. Such a possibility kept me on my toes. Suddenly, I had a truly dark thought. What if she was having an affair? I immediately dismissed that disgusting idea. My cookie would never cheat on me. But I couldn't get the thought out of my head, because it seemed to answer a lot of my questions. What was she really doing all those nights she was working late? She could have been out with clients, but she could also, I realized, have been out with her lover. Why didn't she tell me where she was going anymore? Was it because she didn't care? Or because she didn't want me to know? Why was she so condescending to me when we were together? Did she despise me now that I had become her gutless cuckold? The longer I sat and pondered, the more I felt an angry suspicion seize me. Something had to be done to stop this train of thought before I did something stupid and irreversible. So I got up from my desk and put on my old work clothes. Then I got out the lawnmower and started working our lawn until it was too dark to see any further. The exercise helped a little. I still couldn't help but think about the situation, but I had calmed down enough to develop a plan of action. When the network starts having problems, the first thing I do is run a series of tests to determine the cause. I need to do the same with my marriage, run diagnostics, and figure out what went wrong. Over a dinner of leftovers, I pondered what diagnostic tools I could use. I was well aware of the many electronic marvels that could easily be used to spy on someone, but the more I thought about it, the more complicated the problem became. Sure, I could set up microphones and cameras around the house, but with Anne spending so little time at home, it was unlikely to do any good. I was concerned about the time she spent away from home. I considered putting a beacon on her car, but what good would that do? Between real estate shows and city council meetings, my wife spent most of her time traveling. Parking in a hotel? She was constantly attending luncheons and holding meetings in hotel conference rooms. Miniature recording devices? Trying to tap every cell phone she had? There was nothing wrong with that. I knew the answer but didn't want to use it because I thought it would be expensive. But hiring a professional was clearly the right decision, so I sat down at the computer and typed detective agencies into the search engine. That didn't help. There were dozens of them. Some had ratings, but I'm pretty skeptical of online ratings and user recommendations. They're too easy to fabricate. Does Craigslist have a section for detective agencies? On Angie's List? Heck no. Next in my search, I noticed an entry about Channel 9 News. Clicking on it, I discovered that a year ago they did a report on local detective agencies. Channel 9, huh? I went to high school with Amy Howard, the girl who is now the news director at that channel. We even dated in college. Nothing serious, but we parted as friends. I called her. Hey Amy, long time no see. Any chance of having a beer with me tonight after work? She was pleasantly surprised to hear from me. I think I can make it, Dave. It's not a very news-filled day, so unless something special happens, I'll be there. As she walked into the living room, I remembered why I was interested in her. She was still as attractive as when we met, but now she had the confident style of a successful professional. It suited her very well. We chatted for a while, discussing mutual friends and our life after college. But eventually, I discreetly changed the subject. Didn't you recently write an article about local detective agencies? She looked at me shrewdly. Oh, Dave, I'm so sorry. I was wondering why you didn't mention Anne. Are you looking for references? Gotcha. I hung my head and nodded. She paused to think. Given your wife's position in the city, I'd stay away from the big agencies. The fact that they have more employees only increases the likelihood of someone gossiping. Does that make sense? Definitely. And you probably don't want a one-man store because getting what you need in a timely manner can be a problem. It's hard for the owner to do more than one or two things at once. I nodded. That made sense too. If you're looking for something in between, we've had good reviews on the Masterson agency. It's not the cheapest store in town, but the clients we talked to said they work thoroughly, professionally, and get results in a reasonable amount of time. She paused. Dave, the private detective business is a bit scrappy by nature, but you could do a lot worse than turning to Masterson. That seemed like a good call, and I thanked her. But as I got up to leave, she reached across the table and squeezed my palm. It was good to see you, Dave. I hope things work out for you. Keep me posted. I promised her I would. As I drove home, I thought about our conversation. Damn, how I wanted to keep my marital problems a secret. Hopefully, Amy would be careful. The next day, her recommendation still made sense to me, and I called the Masterson agency to make an appointment. As luck would have it, the woman I spoke to said I could meet with Mr. Masterson himself if I came in first thing in the morning. I'll come, I promised. Fortunately, Anne got home on time that evening, and we had dinner together for the first time in days. Considering what I had to do, I was nervous about having to strike up a conversation with her, but I needn't have worried. She spent the entire evening ranting about the arrogance of some businessman who was thinking about running for office in the next election. I didn't have to say much, or play much. Now, the next morning I got up early and skipped breakfast so I wouldn't be late for my meeting. After leaving a note for Anne on the bulletin board, I got in my car and drove downtown. To my surprise, traffic was free and I arrived earlier than I expected. I checked the Masterson agency's address again and realized it was next door to my favorite coffee shop, the Stranger Brew. When this establishment opened 10 years ago, there was a lot of talk about its name and what it meant. Some thought it reflected a unique blend of house beers. Others swore the new owner was a former hippie with a sense of humor. But Anne checked the records at City Hall and found that the owner's name was Joe Stranger. Anyway, Stranger Brew had every advantage over the big coffee shop chains as far as I was concerned. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who liked the place. Even at such an early hour, I was lucky enough to find an empty seat when I got there. As I sat there sipping my coffee and eating my breakfast sandwich, more and more customers came in. Suddenly, there was a commotion at a nearby table, and I looked up to see a large red-faced man yelling at a young Latina woman sitting alone. "You're not done yet? What gives you the right to take a table when other people want to sit down?" The young woman sat silent, clearly taken aback by the man's sudden outburst. This seemed to infuriate her accuser even more. "You're a goddamn Mexican, aren't you? I bet you're a goddamn wetback. First you come and take our jobs away from us, and now you're taking a table in my cafe. Why don't you swim home across the Rio Grande where you belong?" He reached out and slid his hand across the table, spilling coffee all over the floor. Before I knew it, I was between the women's and men's tables. "Why don't you leave her alone? She was here before you and has every right to this table. You should buy her another cup of coffee and apologize for insulting her." The man's face turned even redder and I tensed, expecting him to lash out at me. But his gaze suddenly shifted to something behind me, and turning around, I saw the owner standing there. The stranger wasn't a big guy, but he had a sawed-off pool cue in his hands. "You," he growled at my adversary, "get out of my store and don't come back. You have no right to bully my customer, and I certainly don't want your business." I thought the man might decide to pick a fight after all, but he looked at Joe's pool cue, then at me, and finally decided not to risk it. "Okay," he said as he walked out of the cafe. "I'm glad to leave. This place sucks anyway." When the noise died down, I turned to the shocked woman. "I'm really sorry about this, miss. May I offer you another cup?" The woman looked at me shyly. "You don't know me. Why would you do that?" I shrugged. "I don't. I guess I hate bullies and bigots." She smiled and held out her hand. "I'm Maria Elena Alvarez, and I'm very grateful for what you've done. There are many who don't feel what you feel, and even fewer who are willing to step in to help a stranger." "You're welcome, Maria Elena. I'm David Davis, and I'm glad I could help." At that moment, Joe returned with 2 cups of coffee. "I brought a fresh cup for each of you. I apologize for what happened, and I hope you feel comfortable coming here in the future." We assured him that we would definitely come back, and then Maria looked at me. "Would you like to have coffee with me? It'll free up your table for others." "If you don't mind the company, I'd love to join you." I sat down next to her and we started chatting, sipping coffee from steaming paper cups. She shook her head sorrowfully. "I ended up here completely by accident. I have a new job nearby, and I came here early because I didn't want to be late for my first day." She took another sip and looked at me. "Do you come here often?" "Not as often as I'd like. I actually have a personal business meeting first thing today, and I didn't want to be late." She nodded, then looked at her watch. "Actually, I should get going." She stood up and held out her hand again. "Thanks again, David, for coming to my rescue. It was a pleasure meeting you." and I won't forget what you did." I shook her hand and watched her walk out the door. I took another sip of my coffee and decided it was time to hit the road. Walking out of the coffee shop, I headed down the sidewalk towards the Masterson Agency address. Looking up, I noticed Maria walking ahead of me in the same direction. When she stopped at a stoplight, I caught up with her at the intersection. She noticed me, smiled, and nodded. After crossing the street and walking a little more, she looked back and saw me following her. She frowned. Damn, I don't want her to think I'm following her. Then, to my horror, she walked into the lobby of the same building I was headed to. I deliberately waited a little longer, hoping that when I entered, she would be gone. But when I opened the door, I saw her standing in the lobby with her arms folded and a concerned face. "Look," she said as I hesitantly approached her. "I really appreciate what you did at the cafe, but that doesn't mean you have the right to—" "No, no," I interrupted. "I promise I won't follow you. At least not intentionally. It's just that I have an appointment in this building." She gave me a skeptical look, then turned and walked toward the elevator. I followed her, and when the door opened, got in as well. She pressed the fourth floor button and then turned to me questioningly. "I'm going to the fourth floor," I told her helplessly. She frowned again but said nothing. I stepped back as she got off on the fourth, but she started walking down the hall toward the Masterson Agency. As I slowly followed her, she turned around and frowned. Suddenly, as we approached the door to the agency, a look of understanding appeared on her face and the frown dissipated. She stopped in front of the door labeled Employee Entrance and turned to me. "Good luck with your business, David." Now I understood. I nodded at her. "Thank you. And good luck with your new job, Maria." As I walked into the main entrance of the agency, all I could think was, damn, she has to know why I'm here today. Now I had two people who knew I needed a detective. After giving my name to the receptionist, I wasn't immediately ushered into Bradley Masterson's office. I didn't know how well things were going at the agency, but at least I had a senior specialist, and that was something. If anyone's last name was good enough for Masterson, it was him. He definitely looked masterful. My height was just above average, and when he stood up, I looked up at him. Not only that, but he was built like a midfielder. I felt a little intimidated. Once we shook hands and I started to explain why I had come to see him, he quickly put me at ease with his professionalism. He skillfully guided me through a series of questions about my wife, my suspicions, her habits, and a number of other factors I might not have thought of. This guy really knows his stuff. After half an hour of conversation, he leaned back in his chair. "The fact that your wife is a member of the council actually makes the job a little easier. She's used to being out in public and seeing strangers around her. Surveillance shouldn't be a problem." A warning chime rang in my head. Your men need to be careful. If it becomes known that I'm watching her, it could cause a major political scandal. He smiled like a used car salesman. "Mr. Davis, we pride ourselves on our discretion and professionalism. Your wife and her entourage will not know she is under surveillance." I still wasn't convinced. "So what methods will you use? Audio, video, GPS tracking?" He leaned forward, crossed his arms, and looked at me with a piercing stare. "I'm not going to answer your question because I don't want you looking for watchers or devices. I've had clients who lost weeks of work when they accidentally alerted their spouse." Then he frowned. "Also, I don't want you trying to conduct surveillance on your own. For the next 2 weeks, you are to stick to your normal routine and behave perfectly normally in the presence of your wife. We're professionals. We don't need help, and we certainly don't need amateurs getting in our way. Am I making myself clear?" I leaned back in my chair. "Absolutely." And then the other thing he said hit me. "You said 2 weeks. You think you can get what you need in just 2 weeks?" He relaxed and gave me another of his smiles. "You told me that you've really noticed a change in your wife's behavior over the past 6 months. That leads me to believe that if she is indeed having an affair, it is in its hottest phase. She wants to see him, or her, I hadn't thought of that possibility, as often as she can. At the same time, she's already convinced she's getting away with it. I really expect that we will be able to give you a definitive answer a week from this Friday. At the very least, we will be able to inform you of any suggestive behavior that warrants further investigation." I couldn't help but be amazed. Not only did this man have the necessary skills for the job, but he had a pretty good grasp of human nature. I guess I had chosen the right diagnostic tool for the job. All right, I'm convinced. So, how much is all this going to cost? Without blinking an eye, he named a figure that made me wince. I know it sounds like a lot, he continued calmly, but remember, we'll be using a few people, vehicles, and expensive electronic equipment. More importantly, we will give you answers. You've already told me that uncertainty plagues you. How much is your peace of mind worth? He was right. I pulled out my checkbook. For the next 2 weeks, I felt very uncomfortable. I had never paid attention to myself, so I didn't know what my norm was. Do I look suspicious? Do I show too much interest in my wife? Am I asking too many questions or not enough? But it soon became apparent that it didn't matter how I acted around her. Anne treated me with the same indifference that she had for months. When I tried to ask her about her job, she acted as if she was doing me a favor by answering. It was also obvious that she thought I wouldn't understand her work on the board of directors anyway. I felt more like an irritant than her husband. The following weekend, in an attempt to show my interest, I suggested we go out for the evening. I shouldn't have bothered. She immediately brushed it off. I have open houses on Saturday and Sunday, and you know how they always exhaust me. Damn. We may have lived in the same house, but we were more like neighbors than husband and wife. I was tormented by memories of what our life together had been like. We had so much in common, so many shared interests and favorite activities. I remember sitting together and talking for hours about our dreams and how we could fulfill them. Most painful was the memory of how passionately we loved each other. We would pass each other in the hallway, and the next moment find ourselves in bed in each other's arms, desperate to quench our desire. Where did all that love and passion go? Ironically, the closer we got to our dreams, the more we drifted apart. I realized that I was passionate about my career, not only because of the financial rewards, but also because I found my work intellectually stimulating. Again, I wondered, had I played a role in pushing Anne away? But if I had, I felt that Anne was just as much to blame. She was a good realtor, but she always wanted more. Being elected to the council had been a dream come true for her, and lately she had started hinting that she might run for mayor. I couldn't understand why she was never satisfied with what she had. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that our career paths had contributed to the current state of our marriage. But even with all this stress, a little voice in my head kept warning me that there was something else I was overlooking. Was I being paranoid, or was there a real threat? As much as I hated spying on Anne, I decided I was doing the right thing. Masterson was right. Peace of mind was worth a lot. All in all, those 2 weeks I felt like a patient scheduled for exploratory surgery. I was scared to death of what would be discovered, but I couldn't wait for it to be over. Before the meeting, I stopped by Stranger Brew for my favorite coffee, a prisoner's last meal. Sitting there, I looked around, wanting to see if Maria Elena was there, but she wasn't. Thankfully, the fanatic I had encountered didn't show up either. Finally, it was time. I walked the 3 blocks to the Masterson agency like a condemned man walking the Green Mile. While I was giving my name to the receptionist, Masterson startled me by coming out and walking me back to his office. Uh-oh, this couldn't be good news. He sat down and placed his hands solemnly on the folder on his desk, and his face turned into a mask. I couldn't take the tension any longer. So what's the verdict? What did you find? Instead of answering, he slid the folder toward me. I think it's best if you see for yourself, he murmured, and my heart fluttered in my chest. Shit, shit, shit. I hesitantly opened the folder and picked up the first picture. It showed my wife standing outside a house I had never seen, holding the door open for a young couple. In the corner of the photo, I could see a barely visible for sale sign. I quickly picked up the next photo. It was obviously taken from the visitors' gallery and showed Anne sitting in her seat in the council chamber. Below it was a picture of her talking to Mayor Dalloway in the hallway of City Hall. Behind it was a picture of Anne walking through the door of her real estate agency. Confused, I hastily flipped through the rest of the photos in the folder. Each one looked completely innocuous, exactly how I expected to see my wife. When I looked at Masterson in confusion, his grim face was replaced by a wide grin. Mr. Davis, I am happy to report that your wife is not cheating on you. Not only has she not sneaked off to a lover, but she's exhibited absolutely no behavior that we would consider even remotely suspicious. He leaned back in his chair and put his hands behind his head in a relaxed pose. Your wife, Mr. Davis, is multifaceted. She's a dedicated elected official, she's a busy and successful realtor, she's a determined woman. But I can assure you without reservation that she is not an unfaithful wife. Then his face took on a more serious expression. I know you've had questions about her, and I suspect the last 2 weeks have been very difficult for you. But now you can put all those doubts and fears out of your mind and focus on enjoying your marriage. He gave a friendly smile. Most of the time, my job is to give husbands or wives terrible news about their spouse. I really like it when I give good news for a change. He stood up to shake my hand. You're a lucky man, Mr. Davis. I was delighted. The doctor had just told me that that spot on the X-ray was empty. Relief came over me like cool water on a hot day. I shook his hand again, struggling to find the words to express my gratitude. The big man smiled and reached into his desk drawer to pull out an envelope. Here is the rest of the bill for our work. I hope you will feel that the money was not wasted. If you pay the receptionist on your way out, it will save us from having to send the bill home to you. I don't think you'll want us to do that, he laughed. I don't want to use all those hackneyed cliches about walking on air. Suffice it to say that I left Masterson's office in a happier mood than I had been in a long, long time. At first, I simply enjoyed the relief, but soon a new thought struck me. I need to start rebuilding my marriage immediately. I need to show Anne how much I love her. I need to stop taking her for granted. By the time I got back to the office, I had a whole list of things I wanted to do. Luckily, there was nothing on Anne's schedule for the weekend, so I could party heartily. I started taking notes. Friday night, flowers, dinner from a little Mediterranean restaurant Anne loves, bubble bath, new sheets on the bed. I'm going to make tonight all about her. Saturday, breakfast in bed, a trip to the spa, more flowers, reservations at the best restaurant in town, a full-body oil massage, and then the sex we had when we first got married. I smiled happily. It was going to be okay. As I expected, Anne didn't get home until 7 o'clock from the zoning committee meeting. Staggering, she walked into the living room and sank down on the couch. I'm tired, she moaned. I don't know if I can cook tonight. Suddenly, she looked up. What is that delightful smell? Looking around, she noticed a flower arrangement in a vase on the coffee table. Where did those flowers come from? I walked over to the couch and knelt down beside her, smiling broadly. These beautiful flowers are for my beautiful wife, and what you are feeling is dinner already prepared and waiting. She looked at me in amazement and then grabbed the vase. They're beautiful, she exclaimed. Let's take them to the dining room so I can enjoy them at dinner. I hurried into the kitchen to prepare her plate, and by the time she took her seat, everything was ready. Then I slipped a clean towel over my arm and showed her the bottle of her favorite wine I had chilled in the fridge. Would you care for a glass, my lady? She nodded gratefully, and after filling our glasses, we began our meal. After a few minutes, she set her fork aside. This is wonderful. You haven't done anything like this in a long time. To what do I owe such luxurious treatment? Then her face darkened. Have you done something you feel guilty about? I knew that question would follow. Yes, I answered boldly. I neglected you for too long. You worked like a Trojan, doing the equivalent of 2 full days' work, and I was so consumed with my job that I didn't take the time to appreciate you. I'm lucky to have you as my wife, and I'll make sure you know that I feel that way. She sat like that for a moment, and then her face spread into a smile. We really did neglect each other, didn't we? Then she lowered her eyes and gestured toward the table. Is there anything else? Sure, I replied enthusiastically. After dinner, I'll make you a bubble bath and you can soap as long as you want to relieve the pain. Then I'll tuck you into bed so you'll get a good night's sleep. I grinned. You're going to need it because I have more planned for tomorrow. I hadn't seen a smile like that from her in a long time. Later, when she climbed under the covers after her bath, she stared at me in surprise. Is that new bedding? She asked, running her fingers over the pillow cover. Finest cotton with the highest thread count I could find, I smugly answered her. Now lie back and enjoy happy dreams. She smiled gratefully once more and closed her eyes as I turned out the light and closed the bedroom door. When I went in to see her a couple hours later, she didn't even move. The next morning, she was still asleep when I walked in with a tray of eggs Benedict, hash brown potatoes, and mimosas. Don't be late, I warned her. You have a spa appointment at 10 o'clock. She shook her head in surprise. You're spoiling me, you know. I hope so. You deserve it. Oh, and after you're done at the spa, why don't you run down to the mall and see if there's anything you'd like to wear to Il Fiorentino tonight? She frowned as I walked down the stairs. Dinner that night was special. Anne had indeed found a new dress, and when I saw it, I knew I was in luck. When the waiter brought the bottle of Prosecco I had ordered, I raised my glass in a toast. To the beautiful woman who has made me the luckiest man in the world. She took a sip, then tilted her head questioningly. Are you sure you're not guilty of anything, Dave? You don't have a mistress anywhere, do you? I shuddered, because I suspected her of that. Absolutely not, Cookie. First of all, I take my wedding vows very, very seriously. And second, I could never find anyone I'm more attracted to than you. I took another sip of wine. And I know you'll never do that to me either. Never, she said, and raised her glass to drink to me in return. Our dinner was excellent, but we skipped dessert so we wouldn't get full. We finished our second bottle of wine, and as we walked up the stairs hand in hand, we giggled lightly. When we reached the bedroom, she turned to me and inarticulately asked, So what's next, my dear husband? What happened next was we had the best night of our lives. We had a great time. We both slept in so late that we missed breakfast and went out for brunch. I intentionally didn't plan anything special for Sunday because I wanted us to have a normal day. After brunch, we came home and did the usual weekend activities. Anne went to the grocery store to restock the refrigerator, and I mowed the lawn. After lunch, I sat down at the computer to check email, and Anne went to show the house to a potential buyer who called about one of her listings. It all seemed normal and happy, just like our life together. As I drove to work on Monday morning, I was in a great mood. The wife care project was going great. I felt closer to Anne than I had in months, and I was sure she felt the same way. I even left a special note on our bulletin board. Cookies are delicious, cookies are sweet, cookies, you make my life complete. Pretty corny, I know, but at that moment I really felt it. Work was going smoothly, and I made sure to leave in time to make it to greet Anne. When I heard the garage door open, I froze in anticipation and smiled as she headed my way. Slap! She slapped me across the face with all her might, causing me to jerk backward and my ears to ring. What the hell was that? I screamed. You son of a bitch! She yelled at me. You spied on me. You hired a detective agency to spy on me, to photograph my every move. You don't trust me. Oh God, this was not good. She stood with her fists clenched, her face red with anger. I can't believe you disrespect me so much. Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to find out your husband doesn't trust you? She paused to catch her breath. Well, what can you say for yourself? What could I say? She was absolutely right. I didn't trust her. I was stalking her. How could I make it up to her? I stood there like an idiot, desperately trying to think of anything that could salvage the situation. But I trust you, Cookie. I know you've been loyal and honest. You bet. After you had me by the tail for 2 weeks. Her face contorted even more. And don't ever call me Cookie again. All I could do was stare dumbly at the floor. My silence pissed her off even more. Looks like I was right about this weekend after all. You were only nice to me because you felt guilty about what you did. No, Anne, that's not true, I started, but she interrupted me. Well, if you didn't feel guilty, you damn well should have. Tears of rage flowed from her eyes as she looked at me. I've never been treated so horribly in my life, and to have it done by my own husband. She spun in place and headed for the stairs. I can't even look at you right now. With those words, she stomped up the stairs and I heard our bedroom door slam shut. I sink down onto the couch, resting my head on my hands. This is awful. It can't get any worse. What can I say? What can I do to make it up to her? I stood up and paced around the room, my thoughts going in circles as well. I don't think flowers or candy will help. Right now, I feel like there is no gift I can give her at any cost to get her back. A price? Oh, hell. What if she finds out how much money I paid Masterson? Then she'd just freak out. My jaw started to ache, so I went into the kitchen and put ice in a plastic bag on it. I deserved it. Hell, I deserved much worse. Then, an even worse thought occurred to me. What if she wanted a divorce? I really couldn't blame her. Why had I let my paranoia take over? I heard her coming up the stairs and wondered what she was doing. After a while, she came downstairs and picked up her purse. Throwing me an angry look, she hissed, "I don't want to be in the same house with you," and headed for the door. I hurried after her. "Are you coming back?" "I haven't decided yet." With those words, she headed to her car and drove off, tires squealing. I stood there helplessly for a minute, then decided to go upstairs and see what she was doing there. At first glance, our bedroom looked normal, but when I caught a glimpse of the guest room, I realized everything. She had pulled all my clothes out of my closet and haphazardly scattered them on the guest bed. Everything I had stored in my dresser drawers was unceremoniously piled on the guest room floor. Sighing, I began to gather my belongings and spread them out in the guest room. Looks like I'll be sleeping here for the foreseeable future. At least she wasn't going to kick me out of the house. I wasn't very hungry, but I forced myself to eat the rest of my food while I waited for her to return. It kept happening later and later, and eventually I gave up and went to bed. After a while, I woke up to the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. I pulled myself up in bed to see her walk past. A moment later, the bedroom door slammed shut, and I heard the click of the lock. I sank back down onto my pillow in fear. After a sleepless night, I got up early and headed to the guest bathroom to shower and shave. Once finished, I quietly tried the bedroom door, but it was, unsurprisingly, still locked. Going downstairs, I made myself some coffee, but I had no appetite, so I skipped breakfast. Before I left for work, I looked up and noticed our bulletin board. I grabbed the chalk and wrote, "I'm sorry, Anne. Can we talk?" I had a lot more I wanted to say, but I left it at that. Luckily for me, there were no major problems at work because I'd be useless trying to solve them. All I could think about was how to explain what I did without making things worse. "Baby, I love you, but I suspected you were cheating on me." Maybe that's not quite the right approach. How about, "Now that I've thoroughly vetted you, I trust you again." Yeah, that would make her feel better. After agonizing over it for most of the day, I finally decided to tell her the truth. "Baby, I was afraid we were drifting apart and I let paranoia override common sense." That had the advantage of honesty, and if I combined that with a sincere apology, maybe it would help. I left work a little early, planning to throw myself on the mercy of the matrimonial court when she got home, but my hopes were dashed when, as I walked through the kitchen, I noticed a bulletin board. My plea had been erased, and in its place, in large letters, it read, "Go to hell." That didn't sound too promising. Nevertheless, I set about making a delicious dinner for the two of us. Maybe we could talk while we ate. 2 hours later, as I sat alone at the table, the foolishness of this plan became apparent. Admitting defeat, I ate my dinner and put her plate away in the refrigerator. I was just finishing watching the late news when she came home. As she headed for the stairs, I couldn't help myself. "I was worried about you, Anne. I didn't know where you were." She looked at me with squinted eyes. "Why didn't you call your private investigator and report what happened?" she asked, and there was sarcasm in her voice. Then she went upstairs, and I heard the door to our bedroom slam. All I could do was groan. That night defined the nature of our relationship. We were in a state of Cold War, and negotiation was out of the question. She came and went as she pleased, and I had no idea of her schedule. We never went anywhere or did anything together. I was sure she was going to divorce me and was wary of any approach from a stranger. But to my relief, the papers never came. Over time, I noticed, if not a warming, at least a gradual change in our relationship. Her anger at me was gradually replaced by indifference. She started talking to me again, but only about pressing matters. "Garbage pickup tomorrow," or "Is there mail for me?" But she steadfastly refused to talk about our situation, and the bedroom door remained closed. Lying in bed at night, my thoughts went from one emotion to another, like those annoying spinning gifs you see on the internet. I started by feeling resentful and defensive about her treatment. How long is she going to keep this up? It's not like I did anything wrong to her. It's unfair of her to shut me out like that. But just as quickly, I'd move on to remorse. "This is all your fault, David. Think how angry you'd be if she did the same thing to you. How long would it take you to get over it?" Then I'd go back to remorse. Most of all, I felt deep pain. I missed my wife. I missed the physical and emotional closeness we shared. My goal had been to bring us closer together, and all I had accomplished was to distance us from each other. I couldn't stop thinking about the wonderful weekend we had spent together just before everything went to hell and mourned my loss. People around me were starting to notice my depression, but their questions and concerns were only making it worse. The last thing I wanted to do was discuss what I had done. I didn't doubt the reaction I would get, especially from my girlfriends. They would be outraged at what I had done. Worse, the fact that I'd used a detective to spy on Anne, if it became public, would surely cause rumors. It could be used against her during the election campaign. If I messed up Anne's political future, we would definitely be finished. I felt trapped in a hopeless situation. I felt really bad, but there was no one to talk to about it. Now I knew what purgatory was. One Sunday, I went for a walk in the woods, hoping the fresh air would help clear my thoughts. After walking along a path for about an hour, I came to a small clearing and sat down on a log to rest. The serenity of the landscape contrasted with my inner turmoil. I can't live like this anymore. I love Anna, but we are no longer married. It's not fair to me, and it's not fair to her to go on like this. We both played our part, but I have to take most of the blame. Our marriage is dead and I'm the one who ruined it. Strangely, as soon as I came to that conclusion, a sense of relief came over me. I took a deep breath and looked around at the sky, the trees, and the clearing. It's so wonderful here. I wish Anne could look at it with me. Then I realized what I had just thought, and a bitter taste of defeat appeared in my mouth. Stuck with work the following Monday, I made inquiries and found a family law firm that advertised a non-confrontational approach to dissolving marriages in a respectful environment. I loved it. If our marriage was beyond repair, I wanted to end it as painlessly as possible. I called and made an appointment for later in the week. I had just had time to hang up when the phone rang again. "Is this David Davis?" asked a hesitant voice that sounded vaguely familiar. "Yes, who's calling, please?" "This is Maria Elena Alvarez. I don't know if you remember me, but we met at Stranger Brew and—" Of course, the girl is in trouble. "I remember you, Maria Elena. What can I do for you?" "Yeah, I need to talk to you about something very important." Okay, I guess I can do that. What do you need to talk to me about?" No, it needs to be discussed in person, face to face." "What is this, some kind of tremor?" "It doesn't sound like him, but still." "I don't really understand. If you could explain." "Please, David. I urgently need to see you right now, if at all possible. I can come to your office if that would help." I started to refuse, but something in her tone and the whole situation intrigued me. Still, it was better to be cautious and choose a public place. "No, my office isn't suitable. How about this? I can be at Stranger Brew in 15 minutes. Will that suit you?" "Yes, it's beautiful there. I'll see you there, thanks." What the hell had I gotten myself into? But she had seemed like a nice person before, and now there was an urgency in her voice. I put my work aside and started walking towards the cafe. When I walked in, she was already waiting for me at a table at the back of the hall. She stood up and shook my hand as I approached her, then offered me a cup of my favorite coffee. I took a sip, trying to figure out the best way to start. I decided to temporarily limit myself to small talk. "So, how's Masterson's independence coming along?" A sour expression appeared on her face. "Not so good. I was fired yesterday." "Fired? What happened?" "I'll tell you about it later. I'll ask you first, how are things with your wife?" I was shocked. How did she know about Anna and me? Then I mentally slapped myself. Of course she knows. She saw me come into the agency. Hell, she must have been part of the team that followed Anne. At that moment, all my troubles came flooding back at me, and I felt the depression coming back to me. I leaned back in my chair and shook my head. Things aren't going well, not well at all. Somehow Anne found out I was following her and blew up. And then, to my surprise, all my pain and sadness came pouring out, and I told this almost stranger the story I had kept to myself for so long. She looked at me expressionlessly as I told her about my grief. When I finally finished, she tilted her head to one side and asked, "When you met with Mr. Masterson, did he show you the surveillance photos?" "Yes, of course. Why?" "And what were they depicting?" I was confused. They showed Anne going about her normal business, meeting home buyers, going to council meetings, working in her office. Everything was perfectly normal, perfectly innocent. Why? She leaned toward me with a strained expression on her face. David, yesterday morning at the agency, I needed to make copies of some documents. When I went to the copy machine, I found your folder of documents there. She blushed slightly. I shouldn't have touched it, but I remembered how kind you were to me, and I got curious, so I looked inside. I saw the pictures you just described, David, but there were other pictures in there that Masterson must not have given you. David, I saw some pictures of your wife in the arms of another man. They were pictures of them having sex. What? That's impossible, Masterson assured me. That's not all, David. The photos had different dates and times on them. This is not a one-time mistake. Your wife is having an affair with this man. I couldn't believe it. You must have made a mistake. It couldn't have been Anne. Why would Masterson lie to me? I don't know, David, but when he caught me with your file, he went ballistic and fired me on the spot. Why did he react that way if he had nothing to hide? Do you have copies of the photos? I need to see them for myself. No, I'm sorry, I haven't had time to make copies. I looked at her carefully. Are you sure you're not making all this up to get back at Masterson for firing you? I immediately saw the resentment in her eyes. Of course I'm mad at Masterson, but I would never use you to get revenge. You were so kind to me, sticking up for me even though you didn't know me. I could never repay your kindness in such an evil way. There were tears in her eyes. Maybe she is a great actress. But I immediately dismissed the thought. She is not lying to me. However, I still had a hard time understanding the meaning behind her words. Okay, so who was that other man in the picture? She shook her head. I don't know. I didn't recognize him. I started to say something else, but she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. David, there's a lot I don't understand, but I think I know a possible reason why Masterson lied to you. Your wife is a person of some influence in this town. I believe Masterson is blackmailing your wife. That stopped me. There were plenty of other people in town who would love to use the scandal to oust Anne in the next election. As ambitious as she was, she'd be willing to do almost anything to avoid such an embarrassing exposure. Without thinking, I rubbed my jaw where Anne had slapped me. Had she been lying to me all this time? Had she treated me like dirt and then laughed about it with her lover? The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I stood up, walked outside, and started down the sidewalk. Maria Elena rushed after me and grabbed my arm. David, where are you going? I'm going to head over to Masterson's right now and find out what's really going on. Wait a minute, David. Stop and think about it. If I'm right, Masterson will only lie to you because it's the only way he can maintain his influence over your wife. Besides, he's probably already deleted those photos from your file and hidden them away. You won't get anything from him. She saw my hesitation and hurried to continue. The same thing will happen if you meet Anne. Do you really think she'll admit to anything? She pulled me toward a bench on the sidewalk. If you tell them what I told you, they'll both say I'm just a disgruntled employee. It'll be my word against their word. She looked me seriously in the eye. David, I swear to you that I'm telling the truth. I hope you believe it. I watched her face and checked my instincts. She's not lying. She's trying to repay someone who helped her. I believe you, Maria Elena. I saw relief mixed with gratitude on her face, but then she turned serious. There's something else, David. There's a reason I wanted to see you now. I learned something else important yesterday. I saw Masterson's calendar. He has a meeting with your wife in half an hour. If you'll agree to watch him for a while, perhaps we can find out what he's up to. Yes, of course. Do you know where they meet? I wrote it down. She handed me a piece of paper with a suburban address on it. 2232 Magnolia Lane. Why there? I growled, more to myself than to her. It's a residential neighborhood. I shrugged. I'd deal with that later. Come on, I said. My car is parked nearby. Soon we were on our way to the address Maria Elena had given me. I didn't say anything, but I was seething inside. I felt so guilty for not trusting my wife, and now it turned out I had good reason to doubt her all along. What a bitch. Who was her secret lover? How long did her affair last? And how did Masterson get involved? Take your time, I told myself. Wait until you know for sure that Anne is cheating on you. Jumping to conclusions is what got you into trouble before. Yeah, but that was because Masterson lied to me. It was hard for me to stay calm. There he is, Maria Elena shouted as I blindly drove past the address. I drove another block, turned around, and came back to park on the street 2 houses down. Damn, this is a really nice neighborhood. Whose house is this? I asked, addressing mostly myself. Then, as we pulled up to the house, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A for sale sign from my wife's real estate broker. Suddenly, it all made sense. That's why they're gathering here. This house is vacant, I said to Maria Elena in a quiet but insistent tone. The owners have moved out and she's been trying to sell it for months. We stayed behind the large hedge that surrounded the property and headed for the driveway. There were 2 cars parked there, but I didn't recognize either of them. You're going to stay here. I'll look around and see if I can spot them, I whispered. I'm coming too, she replied fiercely, and I shrugged. Together we walked slowly towards the house, keeping in the shade of the hedge. We heard sounds coming from the back of the house, and as we crept closer, we noticed French doors opening into a room that must have been a den. We peeked inside, and my adrenaline began to build. Anne, dressed in lingerie I'd never seen before, was lying on the couch talking to someone we couldn't see from around the corner. I gritted my teeth. She's getting herself worked up. Suddenly a figure came into view, and all I could do was stay silent. Bradley Masterson walked into the room, nothing but a smile on his face. Then I saw that they were having fun. I grabbed Maria Elena's hand and indicated for her to go back outside. I had never been so angry in my life. That bitch, I hissed once we were out of earshot. If he's blackmailing her, she sure as hell doesn't look like she's going to resent it much. Should we take a picture? She asked. I thought for a moment, then smiled. Oh yes, we'll take lots of pictures, and maybe get some others involved. I hurried over to Anne's for sale sign, pulled it out of the ground and tossed it behind the hedge where it wouldn't be so easy to spot. Then I pulled out my cell phone and dialed 911. I want to report an apartment break-in. I was walking around the neighborhood and saw 2 people breaking down the door at 2232 Magnolia Lane. That's right. They're probably burglarizing there right now. If you hurry, you can catch them before they get away. I hung up without giving my name, and Maria Elena stared at me in confusion. But I ignored her and called my friend at Channel 9. Hey, Amy, are you still covering that string of burglaries? I've got a hot tip for you. There's been a burglary at 2232 Magnolia Lane. Police have been notified and are on the scene. If you get there fast enough, you can track down the competition and get some great footage. That's right. 2232 Magnolia Lane. No problem, I owe you one. What did you do? My companion asked, but I waved her question away. Let's go back and get those pictures. When we returned to the French doors, we saw another man. Maria Elena tugged sharply on my arm. It was the man in the pictures, she whispered. Do you know who he is? I nodded angrily. Oh yes, I know him. Anne introduced me to him at one of her political receptions. It's none other than Harold Hartfield, head of the zoning commission in our fair city. Suddenly, Mary pulled me away from the door and pointed to the end of the driveway where the patrol car had just stopped. We rushed toward them together. We just saw them, officers, I gasped. They're still inside. If you hurry, you can catch them. The senior patrolman looked at his partner. There are 2 cars parked in the driveway, and I don't see any signs of forced entry. He then looked at me suspiciously. Are you sure a crime is being committed? At that moment, a Channel 9 news van stopped squealing outside, and a reporter and cameraman jumped out to join us. What's the story? Will we be able to get any action? The first policeman started to speak when we heard him. A loud female scream that seemed to shake at the top of his voice. Oh my God, I exclaimed. He's killing her. The 2 policemen looked at each other in panic. Then Anne screamed again, even louder this time. Come on, shouted the first policeman, grabbed his gun and rushed to the front door. The younger cop followed on his heels, and the 2 of them burst through the front door and disappeared inside. Start filming, the reporter shouted to his partner. He then turned his back to the house and began speaking rapidly into the camera. Behind me is a house at 2232 Magnolia Lane, where police are investigating a suspected breaking and entering. We just heard wild screams coming from inside the house and police went there to investigate. Before he could finish, There were sounds of a terrible commotion coming from inside the house. I thought it sounded like an old-fashioned fight from a movie, only in reality. People were screaming, and there were sounds of breaking furniture and glassware. The cameraman focused on the house just in time to see the commissioner walk out the front door completely naked. Right behind him came my wife, dressed exactly the same way. "Wait for me!" she shouted as Harold swung open the door of one of the cars and started the engine. Once she was inside, he put it in reverse. Then he braked just in time to avoid hitting a patrol car parked at the end of the driveway. In desperation, Hartfield shifted into drive and drove into the yard with a roar. Then he spun the wheel, cutting huge furrows in the lawn, and tried to get through the hedge. He almost succeeded, but thick branches stalled the car and lifted the rear axle so high that the tires could only spin uselessly in the air. The reporter immediately recognized the two politicians. He signaled to his cameramen and then rushed to the stalled car. "Commissioner Hartfield, Councilwoman Davis, could you explain to our viewers what you were doing in the house together? And where are your clothes?" The commissioner refused to talk to him, and when the reporter insisted, Harold rolled down the window. "Nev!" Then the cameraman raised his head and focused on the house again. The hunched figure of Bradley Masterson appeared on the screen, his hands cuffed together. The two police officers who were leading him toward the exit didn't look their best either. "Who's that?" a reporter asked confusedly. "This is Bradley Masterson, president of Masterson Investigations," Maria Elena said. "He's a private investigator." The reporter wrote down the name but was still confused. "And who are you?" he asked Maria Elena. "We need to go home, honey," I said firmly. Took her hand and led her to my car. As we drove away, we saw the police trying to disperse the neighbors who had come out to watch. Over the next few days, the news became a citywide sensation. Channel 9 used the footage for a promo on the evening news, and the footage of the commissioner, councilman, and detective covering their intimate places was shown over and over again. The footage was so racy that the national affiliate of Channel 9 picked it up, and it made the national evening news. Soon there were few places in the country where people didn't see the glorious figure of my wife running across the grass. Masterson, of course, was immediately jailed for aggravated assault on a police officer. As he was being led to his cell, he made some crude remarks about the two officers and what he intended to do to them as soon as he was released. The judge hearing the case was not amused by Masterson's remarks and refused to release him on bail. It was more difficult for the police to determine what crimes, if any, the commissioner and councilman had committed. Breaking and entering was quickly ruled out, and when it was discovered that Anne was the listing agent for the apartment at 2232 Magnolia Lane, even the trespassing charges were dropped. However, because of the intense publicity, they had to go into hiding. The morning paper was upset to learn of the scandal, and the editor instructed all city staff to find out what was really going on. "Commissioner and councilman, politics makes strange acquaintances," screamed the headline the next day. I assumed it was all about sex, but I was wrong. An enterprising newspaper reporter did a little digging and found evidence of bribery in connection with several local real estate projects. It turned out that a councilman was soliciting bribes from developers, and a commissioner was seeking favorable zoning permits in exchange for the councilman's sexual favors. Apparently, they didn't hide deep enough because once the story came out, they were quickly arrested and charged with official misconduct. The first thing I did when I got back to my office on Magnolia Lane was to call the law firm I had contacted and cancel the appointment. "Oh," the pleasant woman I spoke to asked hopefully, "does this mean you've reconciled with your wife?" "It means I no longer want to part amicably," I replied coldly. "I'm going to hire a real shark and straighten her out." I guess involving me in this case was inevitable, at least at first. The police questioned me several times, trying to find out if I was involved in or benefiting from my wife's little scheme. Fortunately, Anne kept all her funds in a separate account in her name only. And when I told the lieutenant how I'd hired Masterson to investigate my wife, he only shook his head sympathetically. My friends and colleagues sympathized with me too, but none of them could think of anything to say to me. We all loved Anne and are sorry she turned out to be a corrupt politician and a cheating whore. Was somehow not quite right. Neither was, sorry you turned out to be a cuckold. Most of them ended up avoiding me, and I couldn't blame them for that. I hired a real shark of a lawyer to handle the divorce case, though it turned out to be unnecessary. Given Anne's public infidelities and the likelihood of jail time, Divorce was not an issue, but my lawyer made sure Anne got the worst part of the financial settlement. I thought I was done with her, but to my surprise, I was facing another meeting with my soon-to-be ex-wife. Anne's lawyer called me. She wanted me to testify in Anne's defense. I laughed out loud at the thought, but stopped laughing when the lawyer said she would subpoena me if I didn't cooperate. The thought of being dragged back into a showdown with Anne was hardly appealing, and I considered backing out. But then her lawyer mentioned that he wanted to interview me before the trial, and Anne would be present. Without much thought, I decided to agree if Anne would answer a few of my questions. I was glad when she agreed. Maybe now I would finally get some questions answered. When I entered the conference room of the attorney's office, Anne was there with her. She was wearing one of her power suits that she liked to wear to council meetings when she knew the TV cameras would be there. I had to admit she still looked good, but one look at her face and I realized the stress was taking its toll. "Mr. Davis," Anne's attorney began, "I understand that your marriage will soon be dissolved under favorable circumstances. We're not here to discuss that. We are trying to prove that before Mrs. Davis went astray under the influence of extraneous temptations, she was a loving wife and a devoted life companion of good character. We would like to call you to testify about your life together prior to the sad events of recent months." Driven astray by other people's temptations, I thought sarcastically. Well, that's one way of looking at it, but I restrained myself and looked calmly at the lawyer. "When I married my wife," I began, "she seemed to me the most attractive, the most interesting woman I'd ever met. She was smart, funny, and had a way of putting people at ease that made them want to be around her." The lawyer gave Anne a quick nod and then turned to me with an encouraging smile. She wrote down every word I said. For the first 6 years of our marriage, Anne and I had the same goals and dreams, and I felt we were on the path to achieving them. The lawyer interrupted me. "You mean the first 8 years, don't you, Mr. Davis? I believe you've been married for 8 years. I ignored her and continued. "But ever since she was elected to the city council, my wife has changed. She has become an ambitious, manipulative person, concerned only with herself and her goals. She has increasingly neglected me and our marriage in pursuit of her own advancement. It was the growing indifference and contempt she showed me that finally drove me to hire a private investigator." "No, no, Mr. Davis, that's not what we want. You need to—" "Never mind, Virginia," Anne interrupted. "I told you there was little chance. He was never going to help me." Then she looked at me bitterly. "So why did you come here today, Dave? What do you want?" I folded my arms and leaned across the table toward her. "I want to be alone with you for 30 minutes, so I can ask you some questions. Will you help me if I do?" "Not a chance in hell." No. She stared at me for a few seconds, then sighed and leaned back in her chair. "Okay, I guess I owe you one. You have 30 minutes. "Are you sure?" Anne's lawyer asked. "It's all right. He won't hurt me." Shaking her head, the lawyer left the room, closing the conference room door behind her. Anne turned to me again. "Okay, Dave, what do you want to ask me?" I had so many questions, but I decided to start with the most basic one. "Why, Anne? Why did you do it?" Suddenly, she straightened up abruptly, and her eyes flashed fire. "It's all your fault, you know. I wouldn't be in this mess if you hadn't hired that detective to follow me." I was stunned. "My fault? How can it be my fault? You're the one who—" But she was so angry she didn't even hear me. Everything was going so smoothly until that bastard showed up at my office with those pictures of Harold and me. And you were the one who sicked him on me. I was so mad at you when I found out about it. I wouldn't have had to do that if you weren't having an affair with Hartfield." She grinned. "It wasn't an affair, it was just politics. Harold was a terrible lover and he was smaller than you. I only seduced him because he could get the zoning changes I wanted." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Why do you need zoning permits? It's not like you're a real estate developer." She shook her head like I was the slowest kid in her class. "I don't need permits, but the big real estate developers do, and I needed their support to run for mayor. Like I said, it's all about politics." "So it's all about political support, right? Then why did the cops find over $1 million in your secret bank account?" She smiled embarrassedly. "Okay, maybe it was about the money too." Then her expression turned angry again. "But none of this would be a problem if you weren't so damn nosy." I'm not going to let her lure me into that trap. What about Masterson? What did he want? Dad, half of what I was getting and half of what Harold was getting. Wait a minute. You said Harold was only involved in this case because you seduced him. Her face took on a strange expression. Like I said, Masterson wanted half of what Harold was getting. And after he got it the first time, I discovered that he was far superior to Harold. Far superior. So he didn't have to make you do it. She smiled slyly. Only the first time. After that, I happily complied. She noticed my expression and grinned. Everyone has their own sexual preferences. I was just lucky enough to discover mine. I guess you weren't all that upset that I hired Masterson, I said wryly. She smiled lazily. No, actually, I think I owe you for that. Then her smile disappeared. And everything would have been fine if it hadn't been for those nosy neighbors on Magnolia Lane. If they hadn't called the police, I wouldn't be in this mess. For the first time that day, I felt better. I stood up and smiled at my loving wife. Actually, it wasn't the neighbors. I was the one who called the police and called Channel 9. You did all that? You son of a bitch? She stood up so fast she knocked over the chair she was sitting in. She grabbed a law book off the shelf behind her and threw it across the table at me. She was about to jump over the table and try to grab me when her lawyer rushed in and grabbed her arm. Calm down, Anne, calm down. You can't do this. I wish I could be a witness to your client's character, counselor, I said as I walked out the door. Then I turned around. Enjoy your time in jail, Cookie. Masterson eventually pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of assaulting a police officer in exchange for testifying about a bribery scheme. In addition to jail time, of course, he lost his private investigator's license. Hartfield got off with a lesser sentence, since he didn't actually take any money. But he lost his job, his wife, and his dignity, and was never seen in town again. I figured that asshole got what he deserved. I deliberately avoided all news of Anne's trial, partly because I didn't care what happened to her, and partly because I wanted to be able to claim ignorance if anyone asked me. But when I was at Stranger Brew a while later, I happened to see a newspaper with a sentence announcement. I couldn't resist and read it. As I learned, Anne received 3 to 5 years in state prison as well as a $25,000 fine for soliciting an illegal gratuity. I was also happy to learn that she now faces federal charges for income tax evasion on her personal money fund. Apparently, the fact that the state seized her illegally gained property was not a mitigating factor for the feds. I rubbed my cheekbone. Okay, exactly what she deserved. Maybe now I could move on with my life. My thoughts were interrupted by a voice I hadn't heard in a while. Hey stranger, could you buy a girl a cup of beer? I smiled at her. I'd be very happy to, Maria Elena. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.